All right, so we are still working with trig functions. We're going to learn a little bit about their signs. So if you noticed in the last modeling that we did, I believe, was it this one? If you noticed, in certain areas or certain quadrants, our trig functions, we were having negative and positive answers, okay? So depending on which quadrant our triangle lands in will affect which ones are going to be positive. And you'll notice here, these ones are the negative ones and which ones are going to be negative. And that's what we're going to learn today. So if you noticed on this one, we had 4, -3. This happened to make our triangle be in the 4th quadrant. And in the 4th quadrant, these two were negative and your cosine and your secant were positive. Okay, and so if we go ahead and look at today's notes, it says use your calculator to find the value of the indicated trig function to 3 decimal places, then determine the quadrant on which the angle lies. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and use my calculator. Now you can use the decimals calculator online, which I think is the easiest. You could also download an app on your phone. That is what I am using right now, is the app on my phone. So we need to make sure first that our calculator is in degrees, because if you notice, all of these are in degrees. Okay, so since all of these are in degrees, we need to make sure our calculator is in degree mode. Okay. And then once I do that, I can go ahead and put this in my calculator. So starting with the first one, we have sine of 48 will give us a positive 0.74. Okay, and I'll worry about the quadrants right now. Tangent of 194 gives me a positive 0.25. And I'm supposed to round 3 decimal places, but I wrote a little bit too big to be able to fit that in there. So I'm just going to leave it like that. And then we have cotangent. So the way you put cotangent in your calculator would be 1 over tangent of 110. Okay, so that's the way you put cotangent in your calculator, because it's the opposite of tangent. I hit enter. That one gives me a negative 0.36. All right, the next one is going to be cosine of 136, and that gives me negative 0.72. And then we have cosecant. The opposite of cosecant is sine, the reciprocal function. So then when we put this one in our calculator, we have to put it in as 1 over sine of 285. And so that 1 over sine of 285 gives us negative 1.04. And then lastly, we have secant. Now the opposite of secant is cosine. So it's going to be 1 over cosine of 320 degrees. Oh, I pressed something. And so when we put that in our calculator, that gives us 1.31. Okay, so some of them give us positive numbers and some of us give us negative numbers. And so the way we figure that out is in which quadrant they land in. So 48 degrees, if we were to draw 48 degrees on our graph, since this is 90 degrees, 48 degrees would land in the first quadrant. Okay, 194, so tangent of 194. This is 180, so then that means 194 would land here, which is in the 3rd quadrant. Then we have the next one. We have cotangent of of 110. And so since this is 180 right here, that means 110 would land in the 2nd quadrant. Move on to the next one, cosine of 136. Again, this is 180. So that means that 136 would be right here in the 2nd quadrant also. And then we have cosecant, and so I ran out of space. There's my graph, 285. This is 270 down here. So 285 would land here in the 4th quadrant. And And then lastly, secant of 320 degrees. Since over here is 360, and this is 270, and 320 lands in between 270 and 360, that would also be in the fourth quadrant. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and put this information into my graph here that I have. So on the first one, we got that sine was a positive number in quadrant 1. So I'm going to put here positive. Okay. On this next one, on number 3, we got tangent in quadrant 3 gave us a positive number. So here's quadrant 3, tangent is a positive number. Okay. Here, cotangent gave us a negative number, negative 0.36. Okay. And cotangent is in quadrant 2. So in quadrant 2, here's my quadrant 2, it gave me a negative number. Okay, here we have cosine of 136, and it also gave me a negative number in quadrant 2. So my cosine is negative. Then on the next one, we have cosecant. Cosecant gave me a negative number in quadrant 4. So here's quadrant 4, and here's cosecant. Cosecant gave me a negative. And then here, secant is equal to positive 1.31, and that is in quadrant 4. So in quadrant 4, secant was positive. Okay, so how can we tell when they're positive and when they're negative? So they give us an example here where we have our little triangle. And so here, when we make our point here, your x value is positive and your y value is positive. So all of your trig functions are going to end up being positive in the first quadrant. So sine will be positive, cosecant will give you a positive number, cosine will give you a positive number, secant will give you a positive number, tangent will give you a positive, and so will cotangent. Okay, so all of them give you a positive in the first quadrant. In the second quadrant, so if we look here, when we go to our second quadrant, our x values are negative. Our y values are positive. And then your radius here will also be positive. So when we set up our trig ratios for our sine will be the only one that's positive and it's inverse. So sine and cosecant will be positive. Okay. The rest of our trig functions will be negative. Negative, negative, and negative. All right. And once we get into the third quadrant, your x value and your y value are both negative. So what happens is your sine ends up being negative, and so does your cosine. And then so is your cosecant and your secant. So if tangent is positive, tangent will be the only one that is positive in this quadrant. So if tangent's positive, then so is cotangent. So it's reciprocal, it will always be the same sign. And then last, in the fourth quadrant, we have here, the only one that's going to be positive is cosine, and that's because our x value is positive and our y value is negative. So your cosine, when you set up your trig ratio, will be the only one that's positive, and then the rest of them are going to be negative. Okay. And so if you want to, because this is going to help you out, this is a really good idea, you need to do this. On a separate sheet of paper, you need to go ahead and copy this down so that you can use this chart when you are working on your assignment, because it's going to be very helpful. So go ahead and copy this down. You can use a screenshot, but it might be hard for you to go back and forth, so I think it's best if you just copy it. So the way that we remember this is using what we call all students take calculus. So all of them will be positive here. Students take calculus. That's how I remember this. So only sine and its inverse will be positive here. Only tangent and its opposite will be positive here. And then the C stands for cosine. Only cosine will be positive here. So that's how we remember what order it should go in, is by using that little trick. So now here it wants to know, when is cosine negative and sine positive at the same time? So if we look on our little chart here, cosine is negative in quadrant 2, and it is also negative in quadrant 3. So those are the two places where cosine is negative. Now we're going to look, where is sine positive? So sine is positive in the first quadrant, and it is also positive in the second quadrant. So the one that satisfies both, or the one that has both of these, is going to be this quadrant right here, which is quadrant 2. I'm going to go ahead and erase all of that. I'm going to put here quadrant 2. All right, now we're going to look for the next thing. Now we're looking for when cosine and tangent have the same sign. So we have two possibilities. We're going to look for where they're both positive, and we're also going to look for where they're both negative. Okay, so if we look into quadrant 1, in quadrant 1, cosine, we're looking at cosine and tangent. Cosine and tangent are both positive. Okay, if we look in quadrant 2, cosine and tangent are both negative. Okay, if we look in quadrant 3, they are opposite signs. If we look in quadrant 4, they're also opposite signs. So here it says when our cosine and tangent have the same sign, it is going to be in quadrant 1 and in quadrant 2. So right here, I'm going to put 1 and 2. And remember, we write our quadrants with Roman numerals. All right, the next one wants to know when tangent is greater than 0. Okay, so by them using that, that is just a fancy way of saying when is tangent positive, okay? And sine is less than 0. So here, instead of less than 0, that is a fancy way of saying when sine is negative. Okay, so looking at our little chart, we're looking for when tangent is positive. That's what we're going to start with. So if I look here, tangent is positive in the first quadrant and in the third quadrant. Then we're going to look at the second condition, that sine is negative. So if we look, sine is negative in the third quadrant and the fourth quadrant. So we look, where are both of the conditions satisfied? Where are they? And that would be in the third quadrant. Sine is negative like they want it to be, and tangent is positive like they want it to be. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and put the third quadrant. So quadrant. All right, the next one. We're looking for when cosecant of theta is less than 0 and secant of theta is greater than 0. Once again, cosecant of theta less than 0 is a fancy way of saying that cosecant is negative. Secant of theta is greater than 0 is a fancy way of saying that it is positive. Okay. So then from there, we're going to go ahead and check cosecant is negative. We're looking for when cosecant is negative. So cosecant is negative in quadrant 3 and in quadrant 4. And then we look for when secant is positive. So secant is positive in quadrant 4 and quadrant 1. So then we look which one satisfies both of these, which quadrant. And the quadrant that satisfies both of these is quadrant 4. So I'm writing down right here, quadrant 4. All right, now the next section. So wants to know when cotangent of theta and secant of theta have opposite signs. Okay, so opposite signs, that means that either cotangent is going to be negative and secant is going to be positive, or when cotangent is positive and secant is negative. So that's what we're looking for. So if I look in the first quadrant, cotangent and secant, they both have the same sign. So then that is not one of our answers. And we look here, secant and cotangent are both negative in quadrant 2. So that's not what we're looking for. Then we look at quadrant 3. Secant is negative and cotangent is positive. That's an example of where they have opposite signs. And then last quadrant, quadrant 4, secant is positive and cotangent is negative. So then they have opposite signs. So then on here, it would be in quadrant 1. I'm sorry, in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. Okay, is where they have opposite signs. And last, we are going to look when cosine and cosecant have the same sign. So remember, they have the same sign. That means we have two possibilities where they're both positive, where they're both positive and where they're both negative. That's what we're looking for. At the same time, they have to have the same sign. So if we look at the first quadrant, cosine and cosecant are both positive. So that's our first option. If we look at quadrant 2, cosine and cosecant are opposite signs. So that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for the same sign. Here, cosine and cosecant are both negative. So then that's our other option. So it's going to be in quadrant 1 and quadrant 3. So here I'm going to put quadrant 1 and quadrant 3. And that's it. So don't forget to go ahead and copy this down because you need this for your assignment. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave it in the comments. Thank you guys for watching. Bye.